Okay, in this video we are going to discuss the box model and how it applies to different HTML elements based on their display property. Okay, so we're also going to learn a couple other CSS properties along the way. And I've got this tree image to help us out with some of that. So on my desktop folder, I'm going to create a new file, and we'll call this box model. And using the Atom snippet, I can just type HTML and press tab, and it starts me out with an HTML document. If you don't have Atom, you can take a minute and copy this over. This is the beginning of an HTML5 document. We're going to put the title as box model, and then we're going to be using a lot of CSS here, so we're going to add the style element. And inside the style element, you place CSS. Okay. And so what we can do right away is we can say body and set a background image. And you do that with the background image CSS property name, and then URL. Inside the URL, you have as a string the name of the URL. So in this case, since it's on our local machine, it's in the same folder as our box model document, so I can just say tree.jpg. But you could also place an actual URL in there. All right, and then we can open this up, and we see this tree is the background of our HTML page. Okay, so that's kind of nice. So we need to learn a little bit how this works. There are a few extra positioning settings that you can apply to this image since it's a background image. So we'll play around a little bit with that. One thing you can add is, as I make this smaller, right, we see the view of the window changes. We lose sight of the right tree here a little bit, right? It's because it's attached, the background image is attached to the left-hand side and to the top, right? So we can also see by default, if I move this farther, right, the image will start to repeat itself if it runs out of pixel space, right? So by default, the image will repeat. Okay, so those are a couple of the properties that have to do with the background image. Right, and we'll play around with some of that. So one thing we can add is we can say background, background position, and we can say center. Right. So now what this does, this has placed the background position to be locked into the center of our view. Right, so if I make this smaller, we see the center of the image is in the center of our view, and as we expand, both sides grow and shrink with respect to the side of the image. Right, but we notice it also pushed up the center of the image to the top of our page, which may not be what we want. Okay, so we might have to adjust this and say background position, we want that to be center in the X direction, but top. So set the top of the image to the very top of our view. And we refresh that. And now this is more like what we might want. Okay, so we see the top is attached, and as we expand this, we see it still repeats. Now we might want to change that repeat. To no repeat, right? And then we have to refresh our page, of course. And as we get bigger here, we see once we run out of pixels for the photograph, it does not repeat. We just see a color background. Well, this means we can use background color in addition to background image. Okay. Okay, so we can pick something that would sort of match our image here. dark green makes sense for this. And then we can reload the page, and we see as we open this up, now we have both background color and background image. Right, so that's a little bit of nice background image wizardry you can do there. So what happens when we scroll? We can take a look at this. First, we're going to have to create a div. It has a large width and height. And we'll call this tall because it's going to be a tall div. And since we're selecting a CSS element or an HTML element based on the class property, we have to put a dot in front. That's the class CSS selector. So any HTML elements that have the class tall will be selected, and these CSS rules will apply. So here we're going to have a width of 200 pixels and a height of 800 pixels. And just so we can see it, background color black. All right. You reload the page, and now we see as we scroll, the background also scrolls. Okay, so that's the default behavior there. All right. Also, we notice that there's a little bit of margin here from where this div is to the edge of the screen. That's because the body, by default, has a certain amount of margin. So in most of your HTML pages, you might want to make margin 0 on the body element. And if you reload that page, we see that margin has gone away. And we'll explain a little bit more about margin here in just a bit. Okay, so we have this div, long div, 200 pixels by 800 pixels, background colored black. And we know that divs, if we they are by default display block elements. If I inspect this element, now I have specified a width on it, right? But notice it still has all of this margin. It's highlighted there. If we expand this out a little bit, when I highlight the margin of this element here, and then the padding, and then the border and the padding and the content, right? This doesn't have any padding or border, but it does have margin, and you see that highlighted. Okay, so this, in the developer tools of your web browser, this is the Chrome web browser, it has a picture of what the box model actually is. So in the very center you have your content, and you see as I highlight over that, that is this black portion. And then on the outside of that we have padding. In this case we don't have any padding and we don't have a border, but then outside of that is margin. Now block elements, they expand their margin all the way out to the width of their parent. That forces any elements beside it to either be above or below. Okay, so that's what block elements do. So if I want to center a block element, then I have to use the margin property, CSS property, and I can go into my my tall div here, and I can say margin left auto, so automatically distribute any leftover space, and then margin right auto, and I can refresh that, and now we see that our div has moved into the middle of the screen. Okay, and if I look at this, we see the margin is on the right and the left now. If I expand this open a little bit more again, I can highlight on the margin and it shows on both sides. Still no padding, still no border, but we have the content there. Alright, so let's take a look at maybe adding a little bit of content. So down here in this class div, we might have a nice nature poem of some kind. You know, all right, so we've got a nice poetic thing here, and this text we know is display inline. We've talked about text before, and display inline is different than display block. This view is display block, and when we see the text layout here, we're going to see that it is the text is display inline. Okay, and that's similar to a span tag. If I create a span tag here around the color red, and I make a class for it, and I can just call this red, and then I can make a span around blue, and then I can edit these and I make the color of the text, which is just the color CSS property. I'm going to make that red. So this red, this dot red, is selecting any HTML elements that have the class name red. So this name is tied specifically to just what I called the class. I could have called this anything. All right, but I'm calling it red because I'm changing the color to red. So this is the actual CSS that changes the color to red. But this is just the name I gave it. Similarly, we have dot blue, and I'm changing the color to blue. Okay, again, this in no way changes the color. That's just simply a name I gave it. This class name is blue. Right? This is the actual CSS that changes the color to blue. Okay? So we have a little bit of text in there. If I refresh the page, we see, oh, I didn't close my span. I need the closing tag there. Okay? So since I didn't close the span, it thought I opened another span inside. Okay, so the red coloring didn't stop here, it continued. Right? So you have to be careful about closing your elements. Right? I'm going to save it and then refresh. Okay, and we see red and blue, but then the other colors we don't see because it blends into the black, because the default text color is black. So we can say color white here. Alright, roses are red. There we go. So we've got some text and we see it scrolls here. One thing we might want to adjust is if we don't want the actual background image to scroll when we scroll, you can set the attachment to fixed. So we can make background attachment and refresh the page, and now the image stays no matter where we are in our scrolling. Okay, so that's kind of nice. Now we can see that a little bit better if we add a little bit more text. We can copy and paste this a few times. I'm going to save it. Refresh. There we go. All right. So now we have some text, a nice poem, and we have this tall div here, which is a block element. Display block by default. If I type display block, that doesn't do anything because that's the default of a div. See, display block, refresh, it remains the same. Okay, so that's the default. Now let's change the background color here a little bit, because this is a nice pretty poem, so we don't want black. Let's change it to a nice pink color. So we know we could just type pink HTML colors. There are named HTML colors, and you can look those up. Right, and that's not quite what we want. We know we can also use the RGB hexadecimal colors. So we can have 2 channels, 2 hexadecimal characters for red, and then 2 for green and 2 for blue. So this would be FF, the highest of the hexadecimal colors. And we see that's going to be full on red, 0 green, and 0 blue. Right? That makes it red, but that makes our word red go away. Right? So we actually want something more of a pink, so we can add a little bit of green and maybe a little bit more blue. Right? And we can save that. And there's a nice pink color right? Roses are red. We can't quite see the red there though. So that's one way to make colors. Actually two ways, right? We did pink, and then this is using the actual RGB color, and then the hexadecimal version of that. And now we can also do the RGBA property. Okay, so this is the amount of red, green, blue, and then the A is alpha, which is the amount of translucency. Okay, so if you have two hexadecimal characters, the number of options you have there, the actual number of numbers you can write with 2 digits of hexadecimal is 16 times 16, which is 256. So the values go from 0 to 255. So if I wanted total red, I would pick the value 255, and then the amount of green that I want, I could say something like 40, and then the amount of blue that I want, I could say something like 150. Okay, this is similar to our hexadecimal version, which is FF. That would be the same as 255. And then I'm just kind of guessing here that actually 40 would be less than the 44 of the green, and then or it'd be different. And then the blue was, let's see, 88, I believe, right? So that was what we had, and we had that nice pink. So over here, we should have something similar, but then we have to add the alpha value. And the alpha is the amount of translucency. So if we have a 1, that means it's totally opaque. There's no translucency. Okay, so the alpha is actually a measure of the amount of opaqueness as opposed to the amount of translucency. Right, so if it's 1, we have totally opaque color. So we refresh and we see that looks nice, and we can't see through this at all. Right? Now if we lower this from 1, the value of the alpha channel is between 0 and 1. We can say 0.2 and refresh. We see that it is very transparent now. Right? As we move this, we see that it's you can see through this pink coloring into the background, right? The different colors there. Right? So that might be a bit much, so we might just do 0.5. There we go. Now we can see our red and our blue. We can see everything nicely. This still is missing something, right? We have the text that's kind of crammed up against the edges here. That doesn't look so nice. We need a little margin or padding there, right? So it's actually the padding that we're going to use, because with padding, you're still going to see the background color. Margin has to do with the area past the border and the padding. Okay, if we look back to this diagram, we have the content, then we have padding, border, and then margin is on the outside. Okay, so if we look back, we can adjust this and we can say padding, and we'll say 50px. Okay, so this is going to put 50 pixels of padding on all sides, top, right, bottom, and left. Okay, so that might not be quite what we want. We might want a little bit less up here, perhaps. In which case we can use the different CSS property value for padding. We can, instead of defining just one value, we could define all 4. Right, so we can start with top and say we want that to be 30 pixels, and then to the right we want that to be 50 pixels, and then to the bottom side we want it to be 30 pixels, and to the left side we want that to be 50 pixels. Okay, so we're specifying all 4 options there. We reload the page and we see we've got a slightly smaller padding here, right, and that looks a little bit nicer. And again, as we scroll down, we see the background image isn't moving, so that's kind of nice. All right, so we've specified a lower margin here now too, so that means technically we don't need this height. We can remove the height, and then the margin should still give us the spacing that we want. There we go, and that looks a little bit cleaner. Right. So we got a little poem here. That's nice. Now if we go over here, we see content, and now we can see padding being highlighted. Content, then padding. We still don't have a border, but then we have margin. So let's add a little border, and we're going to say the border is going to be solid. Actually, let's try something else. Let's try a outset border, and we'll say it's 5px. We'll call it, yeah. We'll say the color is white, and then 5px is the width. So this is really 3 properties. Just like here in padding, we specified 4 different properties. That's the same as padding top 30px, right, and then padding right 50px, padding bottom 30px, and then padding left 50px. So there are shortcuts in CSS to combine properties, but they ultimately evaluate to the same thing here. So padding, this is just a shortcut to explicitly setting all 4 properties. Okay, so same with border. We have border style. Right? In this case, we'd be saying outset, and then border. Oops. There we go. Border color. Here we're calling that white, and then border width. And here that's 5px. Okay, so these 3 properties are actually what are being set. This is just a shortcut for those 3. Okay, so we can remove that one and do these 3 if you want, whichever way you prefer. Now here the outset border you see, and it comes up to the angle here. It makes it appear as though this is slightly raised up, right? As if the light is shining from the top left corner, and then this area is slightly shaded. So the entire thing looks like it's slightly raised. So that's why it's called outset. And then you can do inset, which makes it look like it's indented. Oops. Inset. There we go. And it just basically kind of flips it. Makes it look like it's sunken in a little bit. Then you have groove. Right? Where you see the bottom is white and the top is gray, and then it switches on the sides. And you have, there are several of them, and you can look them all up, dotted. But usually when we're working with display elements, or any elements when we're just trying to position them and use the box model, it's sufficient to just use the solid border. So that's the one we're going to use most probably, so we can go back to solid. And this is just a solid 5-pixel white border around our poem, right? And our poem is nice and centered because we have the padding set up. And now we have all of the elements of the box model. We have the content in the middle, which is our actual text. We have the padding that pushes the content towards the middle of the element. And then we have a border, right? And then we have the margin on the outside. Okay. Now, one thing to note is when we specify the width here, we specified the width of our text. If we go back to the CSS, we see width in this tall div is 200px. Okay. Now, if we add the 50 pixels here and 50 pixels here, we're at 300 pixels, right? And then if we add the border, we are at, that's 5 pixels on each side, right? So that's 310. Okay. So this method is the default method where you specify the width of the content when you use width, okay, but you don't specify the width of anything else. That actually becomes incredibly frustrating. So what we actually want to do is we want to use a different box sizing model, and when we specify the width, we want it to mean the border, the padding, and the inside. Okay, so this is very common to make all of your elements have this new property. Okay, so this is going to be at the very top of your CSS more than likely. So for all elements, meaning star, we're going to make them have a different box sizing. And that box sizing, oops, X, that box sizing is border box. Okay, so now look what happens when I refresh this page. I'm going to save my file and refresh the page. And now we see when I specified the width of 200 pixels, the border, the padding, and the content, all of that is 200 pixels. So when you subtract out 10 pixels for the 5 pixels on each side for the border, and then 50 pixels on each side for the padding, right, you're actually only left with 90 pixels on the inside. Okay, but this does make things a lot easier, especially when you're trying to add in padding to something that's been sized with the width of 100%. Right, so if I have a width of 100% and I want my entire div to go the width of the screen, but then I want to add padding, I have to say 100% minus the padding otherwise. This way you don't have to do that. So this winds up being the most efficient way of using the box model. You'll see this in most professional websites. They'll use box sizing, border box. It makes positioning and sizing using the box model a whole lot easier. So you might add this to your template. So box sizing, and then we go back down, and this is a little bit skinny, so we're gonna widen that on up, and we'll call it 300 pixels, and then we'll be closer to where we were before. Right? Okay, so that's about where we were before, minus, give or take, 10 pixels, right? So here's that in a nutshell is the box model, but we also want to look at the box model using inline elements, right? So far we just discussed we set up the box model on this one div, and we know that's display block, right? So we can look at inline elements and do the same thing for those, right? We've got these two classes, red and blue, and we can say, all right, well, how are they affected by padding and background color, and padding, margin, and width and height and all that stuff. So we'll set a background color just so we can kind of see what's going on, and we'll just make it white for both of them. So we'll copy and paste, and we refresh, and we see we got nice background color there. So what happens if we make the width 100px, and then the height 100px, refresh. Save the file and refresh. So notice on inline elements you cannot set the width and height. That doesn't change. Okay, so if I can right click and inspect this element, and it has content, no padding, no border, the height and width, I can't change the width of the content on an inline element. Okay, but I can on a block element. So when I have a concept of an inline block element, that's kind of the best of both worlds. So it's a div in which you can have, well, any HTML element can have the display inline block, but you usually put it on a div, and the div can be positioned inline just like this type of text, but then also you can set a width and a height, and we're going to do that underneath here. So underneath this big tall div, we're going to add a couple more divs. So we need 3 divs. We're going to call them 1, 2, and 3. They're just class names that I made up. These aren't particularly good class names, right? And I can just copy this and paste it and have another div called 2 and another div called 3. All right, so I've got 3 plain divs here. I need to add the CSS. We're going to add background colors so we can see what's going on. And then we're going to copy and paste and say this is 2. This is background color green. And then this is 3. And background color blue. Okay, so I've got 3 divs here. The other thing I need to do is I need to set a width and height, otherwise I won't see anything. If I just save this page and refresh, there's nothing in the divs, so they don't even have any width or height, so we can't even hardly see them, right? We actually can't see them. They have no width and height, so there's nothing in them. So we have to give them a width and height, even though they have a background color, so that way we can see that background color. So we can say width 100px, height 100px. So whenever you're dealing with alignment or box model properties, Always make sure you set widths and heights so you can see the element, and set a background color. You might set borders, that sort of thing, or padding, and that'll help you find the element, because sometimes if it doesn't have any content, it looks like it doesn't render, and so you can't find it. It's kind of hard to find, right? So this is just a trick to kind of see where things are. Width, we'll just copy and paste this. Alright, again, reload the page, and we see these are block elements, right? By default, the div is a block element, so we see the margin there, right? It pushes everything else to another line, right? It can't be on the same line as this block element. This is our main tall div block element that pushes these down. So I want to make these inline block elements. So I do that with display block. I'm sorry, display inline block. Right, so display inline block allows them to flow like inline elements from left to right, and if there are too many of them, they will wrap just like inline elements do, just like the text. Right, so we scroll down and we see there they are. Now they're flowing from left to right just like these items are. Right, now notice here we have this little space. This is very frustrating, very hard to get around if you don't know what's going on. But we've mentioned that the browser collapses any white space into one single character of white space. So between this div right here and this div, we actually have a new line character and 8 single spaces. So to get rid of that, I can do this, but then my code doesn't look pretty, and I refresh the page, and we see that has gone away, right? But I want my code to look pretty. I want it to have spaces. Okay, so there's a trick that you can do to go back to this. But basically what you have to do is set the font size to 0 pixels, so that white space is rendered with 0 font size, and so it's a very small space. So I'm going to make a parent div, and we'll keep with our number themes, and this one will be 0. And all 3 of these divs are going to go inside of this other div. Okay, and in class 0, put it up here, I'm going to say font size 0. Now in CSS, when you use the unit 0, generally you don't add a unit afterwards. Okay, so we say font size 0, and we refresh. Now there's one thing to remember: we want to make the font size back to the default, because otherwise divs inherit from their parents. So if I add in text here, I can say 1, 2, and 3. If I save this and refresh, we don't have anything in here because the font size is still 0 because it inherited that from its parents. So on each one of these we have to set the font size back to what it should be, which the default is 16px. So there you go. So now we have our text back, our code still looks pretty, and we got rid of that white space in the middle there. Alright, so that is a gotcha that is really hard to track down. So be aware of that. That white space will show up sometimes when you don't want it to. Okay, so that's a little trick you can do to get around it. Alright. So with both of these inline elements, we have the spans up here, and then we have these inline block elements down here. We can go through and apply the box model items, right? So we can have padding. For the text, we'll keep it small on top, 5px, and then to the right we'll say 20px. The bottom is 5px, and the left will be 10px. Okay. And we'll do the same thing for the blue element. and refresh the page. Now notice what happened here. Okay, so it looks like the padding is respected, right? But the width and height wasn't. But padding is respected, but the actual width of the element within the flow is respected from the padding. So the padding on the left-hand side and the right-hand side has moved this comma, right? So the flow is affected, but if you look, the top padding and bottom padding do not affect how far apart the lines are. Okay, so the top and bottom padding do not affect the flow, only the left and right padding. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind with inline elements using padding. And we can see a little bit more clearly by adding the final elements of border. We can say we want, let's see, solid black 1px. Okay, and refresh that. And there's the red. And then add that down here to blue. Refresh that, and we see, there you go, you've got the border around it. And notice what comes after in the document is positioned above the item. Right? So as you place things on the document, the most recent one is looked at as above the others. All right. Okay, so we can check and see what margin does anything too. Right? We can just say margin. You spell it right. There we go. Margin 10px all around, and see if that does anything on either of these. We can refresh, and we see that margin does affect again in the left and right direction, right, but not in the top and bottom direction. Right? So blue, we see the margin has pushed out that comma away from our border. Right? So if we right click on this, we have inspect that span. Right? There's the content, it's the actual text. There's the padding, there's the border, and then the margin. Right? But the top margin did not apply. It's not even there. Okay, so that's how the box model works on inline elements. Now, inline block elements, all of it works just like on the block elements. So you have the width and height, you have everything. Right? So we can say, we can add a padding. Well, first on the middle one, let's add some content that's a little bit better. We're going to add an image. And last time we showed you place kitten. As it turns out, there is a place puppy. So I can connect to this website, and if I specify a particular image size, it will return an image of that size, which is handy for web developing if you need a placeholder image. So this is place-puppy.com/100 by 100. That's the size of the image that I want, and the image tag is a void element, so we can just close it. You don't have to close it, but I like to. Refresh. Okay, and there's our puppy. Now notice we talked about the vertical alignment. By default, since there's text in these elements, the vertical alignment for those elements is the baseline of that text, right? Whereas the vertical alignment for a block element is, or an inline block element rather, is the bottom of it. Okay, so we can test out that theory too. If I remove 3 here, the text, and refresh, we see now it's inline, or its vertical alignment is at the bottom, just like this image. Right? Also note, if I add just a white space in here, right, that does not affect it. I actually have to have a character. If I type in a character here, just one single character is all it takes, then we're back to the baseline. Okay, so these are some of the quirky things with alignment that might come up as you develop your web pages here. Okay, so we can put this back to 3, and then if we go back up, we know that we want to vertically align these. We can align them in the center. Vertical align. And so with vertical alignment, it's not called center, it's called middle. So for vertical alignment, you have top, middle, bottom. And for text alignment, you have left, center, and right. So we want vertical align middle. And vertical alignment goes on the child elements, not the parent. Text align is the opposite. Okay, so we refresh this, and now they're all aligned. That's good. And what I want to do also is, since we have the wrapper element, I'm going to go ahead and text align these. And text align goes on the parent, and so we say center. Text align only works with inline elements. And so here we see that these are inline block. So inline block is kind of a mixture between block elements and inline elements. Alright, so we'll finish up by adding some padding and some border and margin to these last items, and that will conclude the box model presentation. So we'll add a little bit of padding here to 20px on each one of these items. And I just copied and pasted that and moved it around with my text editor. Alright, so adding padding 20 pixels, we refresh, okay, and we see that the padding, because we changed our box model view, right, we need to specify the width of these as 100 pixels plus our padding. Alright, so see the border box, yeah, okay. So the width we have for 1, 2, and 3, we're going to say is padding 20 pixels, so that's 20 on each side, so that's 40, and then 5 pixels of border, so we'll call this 150. So now when we specify the width and height, we have to be including all of the border and the padding as well. Okay. And so we added padding of 20 pixels and then border. Solid border, black, 5px. I'll copy and paste that down the line. Fresh. There we go. Now notice these look thicker. It's because there's 5 pixels of border here and then 5 pixels of border there. Right? So to kind of make that go away, we can add some additional margin. And we'll just give that 20 pixels on every side. And do that for each one of these. Refresh the page, right, and we see we got that flow effect that we were talking about. We need to make this smaller. Oh, I deleted one of my CSS things. That's why it went away. Okay, that wasn't a flow effect. I'll refresh, and there it is. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And we can also, here at the top, we might want to add a little margin to our poem so we can see the top of the image a little bit better too. And that should conclude this particular demonstration. You can say the top we want 20 pixels. We'll just do margin top, 20 pixels, and then margin bottom, 20 pixels. Right, now it's a little bit more centered. You scroll down, and the margin from these is added to the margin from this element. Okay, so that is the box model.